Okay. Um, Good afternoon, I guess it is, everyone. And as usual, I will see if I can get in under the wire here, time wise. I always think first, it's the stages of giving a presentation. You think you don't have enough, then you realize you have way too much. Then you try to alter what you're doing to fit it in, and somehow it doesn't work, and you end up cutting off the last several slides. So I'm going to continue in my efforts to be within the time frame that I'm allotted. Let's see if I can succeed at it. Okay, so the focus topic today is going to be an overview of state raw milk regulations. And actually, as I prepared this, I sort of thought to myself, probably should have called it an overview of why state raw milk regulations exist and how they come to exist and sort of their general features and facets. I sort of jettisoned the idea of actually just sitting here and going through saying, here's what New Jersey just enacted, or here's what Maryland allows, or here's what New York allows. Not real interesting just to go through a list of states. So I have a little bit of a different approach to this. In any event, let's proceed. Here is just a little bit of comic relief to start off. And I've used this before in a previous one, so maybe you've seen it before, but it's the cartoon about all the kinds of new milks. There's grass milk. We take fresh mowed grass and process it just like Daisy's stomach. Or orange milk, don't call it juice because it's not. Or way beyond milk. It's white and it's liquid. Stop asking questions. In any event, we're here to talk about raw milk or those who wish to consume unpasteurized milk. And in a lot of ways, that's the original new milk. Raw milk has been something that has been consumed on the farm by those who are producing it routinely by the entire family for the most part, without a whole lot of consequences, and a very, how should we say, people are very accustomed to it, for the decades that made up the biggest chunk of the 20th century anyway. Um, but now, we're sort of in the age of all these alternative drinks and people sort of looking beyond what they perceive as uh, perhaps we'll say scientific consensus, which people are starting to disagree with in many areas. And I won't call the raw milk movement in any way, shape, or form sort of another version of the sort of anti-science but it's certainly another view of what was readily accepted for most of the 20th century, which is that pasteurization was probably our greatest public health measure. And at least we will see how that goes forward. As we continue to encounter, as we have in the last several years, various near pandemics or actual pandemics. So, raw milk, just so you know, in the dairy world, raw milk is a term of art, so to speak, and it's a term of art for two different things. So it can get confusing sometimes when you see the term. So I just want to make sure people get it, which is raw milk in the more formal dairy industry. Those who understand the PMO and are in the business, and they hear the phrase milk for pasteurization. Raw milk is milk for pasteurization that has not yet been pasteurized in the supply chain. So it is on its way from the farm to the processing plant. And that is referred to as raw milk, and perfectly non-controversial substance. It's simply moving from the farm to the processing plant to be pasteurized. And all throughout the PMO, the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, it's referred to as raw milk, and that's not referring to raw milk that might be intended to be consumed by humans in its unpasteurized form. That is the newer usage of the word raw milk, or a very common recent use of the word raw milk to denote that milk which is intended to be for human consumption without being pasteurized. So if you see the other usage, the more formal industry usage, which is just milk for pasteurization on its way to the plant, understand, that there's sort of two different things here. Okay, now next, okay, why pasteurize? Well, pasteurization, obviously decades old, and has been with us since for most of the 20th century. The big four common pathogens that pasteurization is credited, with, or yeah, we'll say that credited with controlling, is Campylobacter, E. coli, Listeria, and Salmonella, all of which, for various ways and through various methods and for various reasons, maybe I should say, do appear in raw milk that, in both versions, let's just say, of the term raw milk that I used before. In other words, uh, raw milk that's on its way to the plant for pasteurization, or raw milk that someone intends to drink without pasteurizing, can frequently, or occasionally or regularly. I'm not going to, commit to any one of those words, but certainly these four pathogens that cause human illness are known and not necessarily, let's say, surprising to be found in milk that has not been pasteurized. And the CDC has an entire, set of web pages that are dedicated to raw milk, meaning the milk that is intended to be consumed without being pasteurized. And of course, as people that are engaged in public health and human disease control, the CDC is very opposed to the consumption of milk that has not been pasteurized because of the potential to contain these pathogens, which again can be found in the milk, regardless of whether, or I'll put it this way: it can be found in the milk under many different kinds of dairy farming operations, and sometimes milk can even get contaminated, after it leaves the farm, when it's when it's commingled with other milk on its way to the plant. And then sometimes a dairy product can even get pasteurization at a processing plant, can get recontaminated with one of these pathogens potentially, and that's a much more rare occurrence, but it does happen. Now, the CDC, the basic tenets of their view of raw milk is that, there are these big four pathogens, as well as a few other that are less common, and that there are these high risk groups who are at serious risk of human illness, and can potentially very serious illness if they consume raw milk that happens to have one of these pathogens. The big high risk groups that the CDC will talk about is children under 5, adults over 65, pregnant people, and people with weakened immune systems. Now, I took this little quote from their website. Symptoms of foodborne illness from raw milk can include diarrhea, stomach cramping, and vomiting. Somewhat milder symptoms, but in some cases more severe outcomes, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, or and I hope hemolytic ureic syndrome, or uremic, I guess it is, syndrome can occur, potentially leading to paralysis, kidney failure, stroke, or even death. So there are a potential set of very significant outcomes from these pathogens. There are also many times, or there are occasions, when these pathogens don't cause that serious an illness, but it's more what we might equate with a standard run-of-the-mill foodborne illness: diarrhea, stomach cramps, vomiting, etc. It really runs the gamut. I will say this, having been around the industry here since about 2007, when I went to work for the Department of Agriculture, we in Pennsylvania, in fact, actually had a Guillain-Barré or if it's Guillain-Barré disease, whichever way you pronounce it. We actually had a case of that one time with a guy out in Western Pennsylvania who consumed some raw milk and was ultimately diagnosed with this condition. So it's not unheard of that one of these extremely serious conditions occurs. We actually had that happen here in Pennsylvania. It was quite a while ago. But in any event, so that's obviously the CDC's take, and that's where they're coming from. FDA, not surprisingly, is coming from basically the same place, which is that, advising against the consumption of raw milk. And, as we play this out, obviously they have created the regulatory support for their view that raw milk should not be consumed without pasteurization. They at this website, and there's a link here. They have this web page, Raw Milk Misconceptions and the Danger of Raw Milk Consumption, and they walk you through every single one of these assertions, and they lay out their case as to why these assertions are true. And the idea is to counter those who have made claims about what human consumption of unpasteurized milk brings as a benefit. They're basically engaging in sort of a analysis to debunk many of these frequently recited benefits from the consumption of raw milk. Let's just say it that way. So just be aware that's there. It's an interesting thing to read. You can walk through it all. Upshot essentially is that what you're dealing with in terms of public health officials, which is not to consume milk that has not been pasteurized due to these pathogens. And here's a little support if you're interested in reading it, and if you're in a situation where you're seeing lots of claims being made about the benefits of raw milk health-wise for human consumption. This is a website where you can go and sort of see some capsule rebuttals, let's just say, to some of those arguments, which is, of course, what you would expect from, FDA, in that this is, their primary function is to try to, or one of their primary functions is to try to, prevent human illness from the consumption of food, as well as other substances that are under their regulatory jurisdiction. Here's an interesting article that is highly featured on, I'll say highly featured or prominently featured on on FDA's website, which is a article that appeared in Epidemiology and Infection, a scholarly journal called Foodborne Illness Outbreaks Linked to Unpasteurized Milk. Here you see pasteurized with an S here. And relationship to changes in state laws. So what they did is they went through, and as they say here, they had data on human illnesses that were attributed to unpasteurized milk consumption, and they compared that data to the information in each jurisdiction in which the cases occurred as to what the legal status of the sale of raw milk for human consumption is in that particular jurisdiction. Perhaps not surprisingly, their findings are that the more permissive the sales of raw milk are in a state, the more illness occurs that is related to consuming unpasteurized milk. Well, that's because the frequency of the consumption is going up. And you can read the article and see how they've adjusted for that. But again, just another piece of less, maybe a less emotionally charged and more scientifically based analysis of some of the data that's out there. Probably the most important thing to understand about the present day, where we are right now in the fall of 2024, is that we have this brand new sort of heightened risk factor now due to the detection of HPAI, high path avian influenza, in dairy cattle, and that particular strain, which was a mutation from the avian strain, or one of the strains that that birds can contract. One of them mutated, and now we see it in lactating dairy cows. It's pretty much just lactating dairy cows. The beef testing that has gone on to determine what's happening with beef cattle is not showing it. Now, that, as well as a number of other aspects of the investigation of the dairy cattle outbreak of HPAI, has centered on the fact that the hypothesized, I'm not sure if that's the right word to the epidemiologists who are doing it, but the hypothesized method of transmission appears to in fact be milk. In other words, the interesting thing about this the dairy cow outbreak is that it is not particularly virulent with regard to the cow-to-cow transmission. So it transmits from the host animal, in this case, dairy cattle, this particular strain, fairly slowly in comparison to what it was doing in birds. That's been good news for everybody, including the entire dairy industry, as well as anyone else who wants to consume dairy products. But it's also this entire set of circumstance has also led to this sort of a heightened awareness and reliance upon pasteurization to not only deal with those 4 pathogens that we know can make humans sick, but now we have this 5th potential risk. And there's a couple others too, but other bacteria and pathogens that can cause human illness carried in milk. But this newer one, above the 4 standard pathogens that we're concerned about, is really being, or I'll put it this way, the public is being assured that don't worry about the milk supply that makes its way into your grocery stores, because pasteurization kills HPAI just like it kills all the other 4 big pathogens. Correct. That has all turned out to be correct. And that's part of one of the largest pieces of the investigation that's been going on, is to pull product off the shelf, and they're seeing the dead remnants of the virus there that has been killed by pasteurization and is now inert and totally harmless. So it's there, it's being killed, all is well. Pasteurization is doing what it is supposed to do, and that has been essentially used as the ultimate reliance that we still have a safe milk supply. Well, except for those who drink milk that is not pasteurized. And the more people that drink milk that is not pasteurized, the more risk that someday the mutated virus or the virus may mutate in a way that a human can contract it from consuming fluid milk that hasn't been pasteurized. We don't have any proof yet that that is a method of transmission of this particular strain of HPAI, but it could become that in the future, or by mutation or by some other factor. We all lived with COVID, and we saw how viruses can do things that can cause people to have to pivot on the fly, so to speak, when they're in the middle of disease control efforts. And that's sort of what we're doing now with the HPAI in dairy cow. We're simply waiting, while keeping it under control. We're waiting to see whether the virus starts to do new things that we haven't seen it do yet. And we haven't seen it. I'm not aware of any cases where someone consumed raw milk and contracted HPAI as a human from drinking that milk. that may have contained the virus, but that's not necessarily does not necessarily mean that that will not be the case someday in the future. Now, the one thing that brings that all up is that we have had some limited detection in dairy workers, and with the idea that the milk is kind of the method of transmission, apparently, how are those dairy workers getting it other than by uh, aerosolization or atomization of milk components in the air? Is that how the dairy workers are contracting it? That's if in fact that's the case, then that would tell you that maybe there is a significant threat of contracting it from simply consuming unpasteurized milk. So what you get, what I've just picked up recently here in the last few days is this little blue box in the bottom of this slide that talks all about raw. CDC recommends against consuming raw milk contaminated with the live, that's the live A, it's influenza A, and then H5N1 is that's the general umbrella. Let's just say that both the bird carried flu and the dairy cattle carried HPAI fall under that description. Anyway, CDC recommends against consuming raw milk contaminated with HPAI as a way to develop antibodies against the virus. So, in other words, apparently the CDC is a little concerned that there may be information out there that maybe you should drink raw milk because it will somehow, or somehow it will, if it contains the live virus, cause your body to produce antibodies, and then you will be getting somewhat of an equivalent to a resistance, and the proper antibodies, which for example a vaccine might give you, so to speak, or cause to be produced. Let's just put it this way. So that's an interesting fear that seems to be in the mind of FDA from looking at their website, which again is another sort of byproduct of the movement by some to consume raw milk. They're afraid this is going to be on the rise. In any event, now let's go to why we're even talking about this. FDA has taken its position on the consumption of unpasteurized milk and embodied it into the law, and Congress was right there with them, and it manifests this policy, and this policy decision has manifested itself in this interstate commerce prohibition. Now, there's two little aspects of it. One is raw milk intended for human consumption is considered adulterated under federal law, and it would be under most state laws, if it contains pathogens. Of course, that requires that you have a positive detection in the milk of one of the pathogens that's going to make someone ill. So you need to have some lab testing to determine whether the milk is in fact adulterated. However, raw milk transported in interstate commerce is always going to be considered misbranded under federal law because it doesn't conform to FDA's standard of identity for milk. So in other words, it's not properly the word milk can't be used to describe it because it does not meet the definition, the standard of identity, which is the definitional standard for milk under FDA's regulatory system. And why doesn't it? Because of this little paragraph at the bottom that talks about this. Here is the standard of identity for milk. Milk is the lacteal secretion, practically free. Oh, excuse me. Maybe I constantly do that. Okay. Okay. Milk is, let's just say, milk. Oh, we'll go to the second sentence. Excuse me. I didn't even need to be talking about the first sentence. The second sentence: milk that is in final package form for beverage use shall have been pasteurized or ultra pasteurized. So there it is. That's the standard of identity for milk, and you're not considered milk that can be sold in interstate commerce because it's not meeting the definition of milk if it is unpasteurized. So you have an adulteration problem if there's pathogens present from the failure to pasteurize, and you have a misbranding problem all the time simply by calling it milk when it is not pasteurized based upon the status of federal law at this point in time. By the way, I throw a nice little article over here if you want to read something nice that gives you a good background on, sort of the genesis of all of this. This raw milk in court implications for public health policy and practice is is an NIH National Institute of Health article from 2012, but still very current and accurate. Okay, next, this is also a revision that was made in the pasteurized milk ordinance in 1987, which bolsters and supplements the two provisions that I was talking about before about adulteration, and particularly the section about misbranding, because it flat out says no person, this is in regulations now, not the statute, as I was citing before, no person shall cause to be delivered into interstate commerce or shall sell, otherwise distribute, or hold for sale or other distribution after shipment in interstate commerce, excuse me, any milk or milk product in final package form for direct human consumption unless the product has been pasteurized or is made of dairy ingredients that have all been pasteurized, except where alternative procedures to pasteurize are provided for in FDA's regulations, or you're following the regulations for making certain types of cheese varieties, and you're curing those cheeses in accordance with the standards of identity that the FDA has promulgated. And that little last phrase is why we have certain types of raw milk cheese that are completely legal to be made and sold in interstate commerce in the United States. Because of that last little piece of the sentence, there are in fact provisions for certain cheeses to be made with raw milk completely, legally, so to speak, and sold in interstate commerce. Okay, so that's this federal law. That's why we're in this situation where states even, some states have chosen to have more sort of permissive allowances. Okay, the enforcement of the FDA interstate commerce prohibition. There's this document, and that this blue line here, regulatory actions by FDA relating to raw milk and raw milk products. That's a big document on FDA's website that is their attempt to sort of recite how they've enforced it. It's not particularly thick or lengthy because some would say that they haven't really been enforcing very vigorously. Now, for example, people might know of this Amos Miller situation that's going on actually in the Pennsylvania court, started in Lancaster County Court of Common Pleas, and I believe it is now. I think there's an appeal of one of the judge's orders that is up at the Commonwealth Court, I think, right now. And by the way, the National Ag Law Center has a little write-up on the Amos Miller case. I put a link in here if you want to see it. My point of mentioning that is simply that was really started as a USDA meat processing and meat sales case. In other words, Mr. Miller was selling products that were not meat products that were not properly, processed in accordance with, statute and reg promulgated by USDA for those purposes. So it wasn't essential. It was not an action by FDA to enforce the interstate commerce prohibition. There was an actual case that people have forgotten about that FDA did pursue called U.S. versus Daniel Allgaier, where there is actually a permanent injunction entered and it's still on the books. And it was all done in the Eastern District, in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Judge Stengel, who's actually originally from Lancaster County Court of Common Pleas, Judge Stengel entered the injunction order, and so an injunction against a particular person, violating the interstate commerce prohibition with regard to raw milk has been entered once against Mr. Allgaier. Okay, there was a case a while ago, the Sibelius case, back in 2012, where there was a constitutional challenge to the interstate commerce prohibition for raw milk or of raw milk. And unfortunately, that case did not end up reaching a final decision on the merits. It was dismissed because the plaintiffs lacked standing, because FDA had never taken any enforcement action against them. But there was multiple plaintiffs situated in different ways to try to make the case that this was an unconstitutional deprivation of, some right guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution to be able to drink the food or drink the type of milk that you so desired, or to drink milk that's not pasteurized. In any event, so that's kind of the status there. It hasn't been that active, in terms of FDA's enforcement. But what has been active? The actions to try to get around this FDA prohibition. That's where the action is. So, legally, the way to get around the FDA prohibition is that states have, some states have had an allowance for intrastate raw milk sales. And, that's where we, are today, with all sorts of patchworks of different states who have done things and some states who haven't done things. The features of such programs, are things like permits, like Pennsylvania has. Periodic lab testing might be included. There might be bottling requirements. Pennsylvania actually has a requirement about no hand capping. In other words, you need to have a mechanical capper so that people's hands are not touching the sort of the pouring lip of whatever container it is that you're using. And label requirements. There may be warnings that need to be placed on there about those high-risk groups that we talked about. A feature of a state system might be that a single producer bulk tank must be maintained, and no commingled milk can be bottled and sold, as raw milk for human consumption. In other words, and that why? Because that makes the trace backs easier. You don't have any mixed milk. This is all the product of one farmer, so there's only one farm to look at if you're trying to do a trace back and figure out where it's coming from. So some states have done things like direct-to-consumer on-farm sales only with no retail selling. In other words, there's no wholesale transactions where it's purchased and then resold in stores. Pennsylvania does not do that. Pennsylvania allows retail sales. Some states have done like cow limits. I forget who it was. You used to have a one cow exception, then in other words, you could sell raw milk within a particular state's limits as long as it came from one cow. Or there might be a volume limit too. I know that some of the states who have older systems had like a volume limit. Or there's this denaturing, which kind of enters in, where if you're not selling it for human consumption and you're selling it some other way, and then you have to dye it. There were states that required you to dye unpasteurized milk if you were in any way, shape, or form, going to be distributing it. But it may have been in a state where human consumption wasn't allowed. So, people would call it pet food. And that's one of the other attempts to avoid, state and federal law, is to label raw milk as pet food in one way or another. The problem that ran into, of course, is that pet food is a separately regulated substance that needs to be licensed and permitted. And, there's all sorts of hoops you got to jump through to be approved to make pet food. So that's not necessarily very helpful in some states anyway. It does seem that some states are still doing things like that, or people in some states are doing things like that, I should say. And then you get the private sale concepts and the private club concepts. And, that's a whole discussion we could have, in a webinar in and of itself. What, if anything, in that nature is somehow a legitimate way to get around the fact that you're distributing these products, into the stream of commerce, whether it be interstate or even intrastate if you're in a state where it's not permitted. Herd shares and cow shares, that is probably the one area where legal agreements that essentially give an ownership interest to the person that wants to consume the unpasteurized milk give them an ownership interest in the herd or in individual cows, and then properly administer the system whereby they receive milk from those things, those cows in which they have invested, and they are now a part owner. And so this is milk from their own cow that they're drinking, and trying to avoid, either, or avoid the legal prohibitions that they might otherwise encounter. And of course, releases and waivers are always, thrown in here to try to, say that, well, I'm not in any risk of making anybody sick, and my customers know me, and they sign these agreements saying that they're not that they accept all the responsibility, even if they are made sick. And so you get all these different permutations to try to avoid the ramifications of the law. Now, where do you find all this law in the different states? And this is where I kind of deviated from the concept. And I know we're almost out of time here, unfortunately, so I didn't make it under my wire. In any event, there are multiple places where you can go and look at maps of the US state by state. And almost every one of these maps has an ability to click on individual states and find out what the raw milk law is in that particular state. The CDC has one now, and it's fairly well done. This is one from a website called realmilk.com, which many people in this industry, are aware of. They've probably been there. They've been doing this longer than anybody. And again, here is, it's an interactive type of situation where you click on the states and they have large narratives on where to find the law in the particular states that they're talking about. This is sort of there's a separate document that is on the Real Milk website, which is a narrative rather than a map, which is an overview of U.S. state milk laws and specifically regarding raw milk. And literally all 50 states are listed there, and you click on them and it comes up. In fact, this was written by Pete Kennedy, an attorney who I believe is in our audience here today. And I've included in most of these how current they are. In other words, this one is as of March 2018. I believe that the Real Milk is, last updated December 12th of 2023. Now, if you keep going forward, here's another one very interesting. The Encyclopedia Britannica has a state-by-state raw milk law compilation. Never even heard of this one until I just recently found it. And they, if you look at the website, it's got every state. And here I just excerpted Pennsylvania's, and then these are links to the regs in Pennsylvania. Here is one that the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, most of these, of course, are primarily raw milk advocacy groups, that has their own version of a map. This one is, at least the most current, which is it's updated to July 30th of 2024. One of the problems is that the categories and the way they choose in these different maps to designate what's permitted in the state or what isn't can get a little confusing because they're not using the same terminology always. But in any event, there is lots of resources out here for finding individual states. My attempt here was to simply give you an idea on where is all this stuff and what are the basic variables that are in play, which is what we went over in that last slide. If you want the resources, and then I'll wrap up here. Here is Pennsylvania's regulations. All linked to this slide. So you get the slide, you're going to have it all at your fingertips. This is the testing schedule that Pennsylvania has put in place for its raw milk permit holders. And I have to say, this was all done, the Pennsylvania regulations were rewritten in 2010. And at the time when we rewrote those, I believe, and I'm fairly confident it may even be still the case, that Pennsylvania was the only, at least when it was done, and maybe still the only state that has testing requirements for the raw milk supply. Now, they're not testing every single bulk tank load of milk before it is bottled and sold or distributed. That's a little bit of a, it's not the kind of testing that's going to catch everything. It's more indicia of the state of cleanliness and practices at this farm. Is the herd in good health, etc. So in any event, having exhausted my time here, do we have any questions? And of course, as usual with all my presentations, get the PowerPoint, because then you're going to get all the links there and you're going to have everything that you're going to need.
Great, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Please register and joining us next month for animal disease control and quarantines. Have a great weekend.